Imagine walking down the street in your own neighborhood, minding your business, only to have the police stop you, just for existing. That's exactly what happened to one black man who was simply out for a stroll. Officers confronted him, accused him of walking without permission, and even made him pick up trash like he was some kind of criminal. But here's the twist: they had no idea who they were messing with, because this wasn't just any man. He was the governor. As the officers doubled down, treating him with disrespect and making assumptions, the tension in the air was undeniable. The man stayed calm, watching as they continued their power play. But the moment they realized their mistake, that's when everything changed. How did the governor respond? And what happened next? Stick around, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The governor stood there, gripping the trash bag they had forced into his hands, his face calm but his mind racing. He had spent years fighting for justice, pushing for fair treatment, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect for simply walking. The officers didn't recognize him, and they didn't ask questions. They had already decided who he was based on nothing more than their own assumptions. Onlookers passed by, some slowing down to watch, others avoiding the scene altogether. The governor could feel the weight of their stares. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly judged, every voice that had been silenced. But he didn't speak up just yet. He wanted to see how far they would take this. Would they realize their mistake before it was too late, or were they about to learn the hard way? One of the officers, a tall man with sunglasses resting on his head, crossed his arms and smirked. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. The governor met his gaze, keeping his expression neutral. "I do," he replied simply. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He glanced at his partner, then back at the governor. "Got ID on you?" The governor slowly reached into his pocket, but before he could pull anything out, the second officer took a step forward. "Let's not make this difficult," he said, as if he was offering a warning. The governor could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been in meetings about policies meant to prevent situations like this. He had signed laws, given speeches, stood on stages demanding fairness. And yet, here he was, being treated as if he had no right to be there. Meanwhile, a small crowd had begun to gather. Some whispered among themselves, pulling out their phones to record. Others just watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. The tension grew thicker. The officers were doubling down, unaware that the man they were questioning had the power to change their careers with a single phone call. But he didn't want to use his title, not yet. He wanted to see how far they would take this. How deep did their assumptions run? And what would happen when the truth finally came out? The governor kept his hands steady as he pulled out his wallet, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate things further. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way the officers tensed, ready to react. He handed over his ID, watching as the first officer snatched it from his hand. The smirk on his face slowly faded as his eyes scanned the name. His fingers tightened around the plastic card, his jaw clenching slightly. The second officer leaned in for a look, his confident stance shifting just a little. "Wait," he muttered under his breath. A flicker of recognition passed between them, but they weren't ready to back down just yet. Not in front of the growing crowd. Not after what they had already done. The governor saw it all, how pride and fear fought for control on their faces. Would they admit their mistake? Or would they push forward, trying to maintain the illusion of authority? The silence stretched, thick with uncertainty. The crowd inched closer, their phones still recording. The officers exchanged a look, as if trying to decide their next move. Then one of them cleared his throat. "We're just doing our job," he said, but the words rang hollow. The governor took a slow breath, his patience thinning. He had let them dig their own hole, and now they were standing at the edge. The moment of truth was coming. What would they do next? And more importantly, what would he? The governor studied the officers, his ID still clutched in their hands. He could see them struggling, realizing their mistake yet unwilling to admit it. But before he could say anything, a voice cut through the tense silence. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd shifted as another man stepped forward. He was dressed sharply, his suit crisp, his posture commanding. The officers turned and their faces paled. It was the police chief. Someone in the crowd must have recognized the governor and made a call. Now the situation had changed completely. The chief's eyes darted between the officers, the governor, and the bystanders filming every second. He didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. It was written all over the officers' faces. They had crossed a line, and now they were standing in front of the very man who could hold them accountable. One of the officers finally spoke. "We were just checking things out, sir," he said quickly, his confidence slipping. The other nodded. "Routine stop." But the chief wasn't buying it. His jaw tightened as he turned to the governor. "Governor, are you all right?" His words landed like a bomb. The crowd reacted instantly, gasps, murmurs, realization rippling through them. The officers stiffened. Their worst fear had just come true. The governor exhaled slowly. He had been waiting to see how far they would take this, but now the game had changed. The question was, what would happen next? Would the officers try to talk their way out of it, or had they already lost control of the situation? The weight of the moment hung in the air. The two officers, once so sure of themselves, now stood frozen, their faces pale. The police chief's presence had shifted everything, and the growing crowd knew it. Phones stayed raised, capturing every expression, every hesitation. The governor finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Routine stop," he repeated, letting the words settle. "Then tell me, what exactly made me suspicious?" Neither officer answered. The first one cleared his throat, but no words came out. The second shifted uncomfortably, looking at the chief for help. But the chief wasn't going to save them. His stare was cold, waiting, just like everyone else. The governor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You saw me, made an assumption, and treated me like I didn't belong," he said. "But the truth is, I do belong, more than you ever realized." The silence was suffocating. The officers knew there was no way out. Then, in a final, desperate move, the first officer tried to salvage his pride. "We were just following protocol," he muttered. "Misunderstanding, that's all." The governor nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind facing the consequences of that misunderstanding." He turned to the chief. "These men shouldn't be on the streets if they don't know how to treat the people they serve." The officer's eyes widened. They had expected anger, maybe even an argument. But this was worse. This was accountability. The chief gave a single nod. "I'll handle it." The governor glanced at the crowd, then at the officers one last time. "Next time," he said, his voice steady, "think before you act." Then, with quiet authority, he turned and walked away. And this time, no one dared to stop him. The governor walked away, but the impact of what had happened stayed behind. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, the weight of the moment sinking in. The officers stood motionless, their authority shattered in an instant. They had expected control, but instead, they had been exposed, on camera, in front of their own chief, and most importantly, to the very community they were supposed to protect. Later that day, the video spread online, sparking conversations far beyond that street corner. People debated, reflected, and questioned how often situations like this happened without cameras rolling. The governor never made a public statement about it. He didn't have to. The lesson was already clear. Respect shouldn't depend on status. Fair treatment shouldn't be a privilege. And assumptions, no matter how small, can have consequences. That day, the officers learned it the hard way, and the world was watching.